It's a studio that was in existence from 1947 to 1961. And many of their films have been shown abroad. You know, they worked with Naruse and Mizoguchi, Kurosawa, Ozu, you know, very famous filmmakers. So that's well known, okay? So when I thought, you know, what am I going to show here? I didn't want to show the famous film because, you know, what's the point for this, right? Instead, I focused on the latter period of the studio from 1956 to 1961 when, you know, they had a new president, Mitsugi Okura, who was a showman. I mean, he owned these theaters in Tokyo, and he had been a narrator of silent films, what they call a benchi, right? So his background was show business, you know, how to bring people into the theaters, right? So he said, okay, we're losing money with these famous directors, famous actors, you know, the prestigious films, you know, they're not working out for us. So let's change the policy and, you know, try to make films that will draw the young fans. And his idea was, okay, we need genre pictures, we need horror, we need thrillers, we need erotic films. So instead of you know, hiring people from outside, which had been the policy before, he raised up, you know, the young assistant directors, and made them directors, and then used his own young stars. Okay, so you know, the films were made by young people for young people, right? And you know, some of them were made by older directors too. I mean, someone like Nakagawa, who had been with the studio from the beginning, was making the horror films, you know. But you know, the direction was towards youth, okay? And the same thing was happening in America, you know, with the American International Pictures. You know, Roger Corman was working with them, right? So it was like almost coincidental. I mean, it wasn't like Shintoho was influenced by them. But that's what I wanted to focus on, because those films have been disregarded, you know, by foreign critics for, you know, many years, right? They just trashy films, you know. But in Japan, they had a following, okay? And you know, looking around, I mean, you know, what can we focus on? You know, there were already you know, people writing about them, and you know, the DVDs are being released, and I thought, okay, well, there's already something here, you know, and I can, you know, focus on this. And the company that helped us, Kokusai Hoei, had a list of films that they could give us. In other words, they couldn't give us everything. Some of the films were lost, and pretty much lost. You know, you have to like reconstruct them from the master. You know, it's like very difficult. So they said, okay, here's our list. You know, I said, okay, wow, it's a lot of films. So they, you know, helped me. You know, some were available on DVD already. I had some of them. You know, that was no problem. But they had to make some DVDs for me. You know, DVDs and even videotapes. Okay, so I had to look at about, you know, 40 some of those films, you know, and then narrow it down from there. So yeah, it took several months. I started last summer, you know, watching the films, right? So it was, you know, like referring to what was already out there, like doing, like reading books and talking to people and that sort of thing, and then seeing the films on my own and saying, okay, this might be interesting for us, you know. So yeah, that was the beginning of it. I think one, you know, one criterion is, you know, have they lasted or not, you know? And in Japan, they had. Okay, in other words, some of those young, mainly guys, you know, who were watching these films back in the 1950s, became big fans. And, you know, the films remained popular in a kind of underground way, you know, for many, many years. Yeah, so there's that criterion, right? I mean, you know, you can go to the video shops and still find them, you know. And someone like Nakagawa, Nobuo Nakagawa, okay, who was their big horror director, was looked down on when he was making the, like, horror was a very low genre back then. Like, you know, serious critics wouldn't pay any attention. They're like, come on, like, horror films. But I think, like in the 1980s, maybe in his case, even earlier, right, the critics started to reevaluate those films. And okay, well, they were horror films, but in their own way, they were great. Okay, and his reputation started to come up, you know, back in the 1980s. You know, they started reevaluating the directors of these genre films. You know, in the same way, like in the States, well, the French critics started to reevaluate the Hollywood films, starting in the 1950s, like these, are great films, okay? I mean, Alfred Hitchcock was, again, like, looked down on when he was making some of these great thrillers and whatnot, but, his reputation started to come up. So the same thing happened with someone like Nakagawa, right? So he's not a discovery for us. I mean, in Bologna, last year they had a big retro of his films, and not only there, but many other places, right? So he's one director who's really been established as leader in his genre, right, in Japan. So that's one criterion, right? And the other is can I say? You have these developments in Japanese society in the 1950s. People becoming more open about sexuality, and in the underworld, okay, it became a business. I mean, things that would have been totally prohibited in the pre-war period, right, started coming up, right, and this was not reflected in Japanese films very well, okay? You look at some of the, again, the great directors were making great films, but, in terms of what was actually happening in the society, they ignored. I mean, some of it was censorship, someone like Kurosawa made, like Stray Dog and Drunken Angel, and, these films reflected what was going on in society, right? But there was still a limitation into what he could do, right? So when these films came along in the latter part of the 1950s, again, Okuda, the president, said, we'll try to see what we can get away with. Again, he's a showman, and he knows that sensation is going to bring people into the theaters, right? So you have the titles and the posters and this whole presentation, right? But the films themselves were like challenging some of the taboos. What can you show on the screen? Can you show someone nude on the screen? So he was the first to do it in Japanese films. Right? So at that time, again, like the serious critics were saying, trash, it's just exploitation. Right? But you look at them now, especially the films of Teruo Ishii, okay, who specialized in this kind of erotic thriller. Right? He was reflecting what was actually going on in society. He would go off into some of these like red light districts and investigate. And, reflected a kind of reality, okay? And the way he presented it was not, can I say, I mean, he had limitations. There are things he couldn't show, but I think, you look at these films that they're showing a side of Japanese society that, like Toho and Chotsuki, like the established companies were not showing. So for me, it's like a window, like they're opening a window and challenging some of these taboos and whatnot. It's interesting, yeah.
How do they perceive it?
Well, someone like Nakagawa was very influential in the the horror genre in Japan, right? So, J horror, The Ring, The Grudge, right? All these, where did this come from, right? Well, you look back and Nakagawa was doing this kind of thing in the 1950s, okay, and the younger directors making these films in the 2000s, acknowledge that, okay, like he's the father of Japanese horror, and I think he's been influential in that way. What can you show? Well, his idea was you have Japanese ghost stories. Going way, way, way back, traditional, hundreds of years, right? And then you have these modern influences coming from Hollywood and Europe, the vampire and the werewolf and all this, right? So, in his films, he mixed that. In other words, they're not just copies of Hollywood films, but he's mixing some of the elements, into a Japanese setting, right?